continuing to discuss Tucker Carlson and Russell Brand's recent conversation on Brand's show, where Carlson expressed regret on ever weighing in on politics at all, acknowledging the wrong calls he made about the last election, but also praising former President Donald Trump for upending and giving the GOP a facelift, particularly for his stance on foreign policy. Let's watch.
I'm struck by his foreign policy views. Trump is the only person with stature in the Republican Party, really, who's saying, wait a second, why are we supporting an endless war in Ukraine? And that, leaving aside whether Trump's going to get the nomination or get elected president or would be a good president, I can't even assess that. All I can say at this point is I'm so grateful that he has that position. He's right. And everyone in Washington's wrong. Everyone.
You can't argue with that. But it's interesting because often that argument is made in a broader way that says it's the Republican Party that has the only anti-war voices in it. And Tucker's actually making an even narrower argument that he's the only person with any stature within the Republican Party who's making that argument. And that perhaps if Trump weren't there saying the things that he's saying, this broader right-leaning anti-war movement might not really exist in a substantive way.
If Trump had never caught fire and become the nominee and then become president, I think there is a strong argument to be made that the Republican Party would not have embraced or permitted the kind of America First foreign policy that has taken hold. That would, even if the base was agitating for it, the party would not have recognized it, but Trump forced them to do so.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely true. The question now is, was this realignment of the GOP's foreign policy views that Trump is responsible for, is it so complete that without Trump, it still holds? And that's very much a question. I think it's conceivable that it does. But clearly, Trump is the most vocal proponent of it still. I mean, if you get it, Nikki Haley is, again, indistinguishable from George Bush's policy views in 2006. They're the same. Now, she's polling at what, like
less than
0.5% or something? Yeah. So that shows you. Ron DeSantis, who's the only actual rival to Donald Trump right now who matters, is trying to sound like Donald Trump on foreign policy in Ukraine a lot of the time. Now, it's not perfect. It sounds like a performance to a lot of people, and I think some people wonder if in his heart he's more in the older neocon mold. That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, the most notable foreign policy moment for Ron DeSantis in the context of his primary run so far was the gaffe about it being saying that Ukraine was a territorial dispute, which to one side feels like minimizing an illegal invasion, and to the other side feels like not a strong enough statement condemning the ongoing proxy war. That trying to have it in both camps is exactly why people are skeptical of him actually sharing Donald Trump's foreign policy commitments. And so, if you think, I wonder what you say to this, if you think that even absent Trump, the Republican Party would continue along this kind of American first anti-war line, who do you think is going to be holding that line? Mm-hmm. What members of the Republican Party do you think have demonstrated a desire, a capacity, an investment in any kind of long-term or substantive way of holding this line outside of wanting to curry favor with Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, there are several members of the House who feel that way.
For example?
Thomas Massie, Matt Gaetz, Boebert,
because here's the thing. I was thinking of Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance.
Yeah.
But my concern is, and I hate to just keep bringing this up ad nauseum, but it was one of the few interviews where she was asked about this. When we talked to her and we asked her about her stance on Ukraine and the broader argument about ending the proxy war and military spending and American first and this framing that is, Americans are struggling so much at home, why are we spending so much abroad? Mm-hmm. And we were talking to her about this in the context of the debt ceiling negotiations, where some conservatives were saying we need to stop spending all of this money on Ukraine, at the same time that they were advocating for cuts to domestic spending, which were going to disproportionately hurt poor and working class Americans. I asked her, is cutting the military budget really on the table if you, instead of doing what you're advocating for, which is cutting this domestic spending that's going to hurt poor people? And she said, absolutely not. I support our troops. I support the military budget. I don't actually want to make those cuts.
Yeah, I didn't list her for that reason.
So, but this is the thing. I think because so many of those individuals...
there's Rand Paul and J.D. Vance in the Senate, too.
Sure, but so many of those individuals that we think of being kind of in this Trump camp, Freedom Caucus camp, anti-war camp, have never specifically been asked whether they are willing to cut the military budget. They've been singularly focused on being anti-war in Ukraine, and those are not the same things. You can't be only selectively opposed to U.S. imperialism or selectively opposed to the idea that we're spending all of this money. We have 800 military bases around the world, but you don't hear a peep about any other part of the world from this cohort.
Sure.
And that is why so many on the left who are encouraged by there being a larger interest in anti-imperialism on the right are very skeptical of the real bona fides.
Rand Paul has called for closing those military bases.
Rand Paul's a libertarian.
Right.
But they're not, I mean, there's a big difference between
Party, but
these more libertarian
I mean, I wish there were,
Republicans.
obviously, I wish there were more of them. I would also just say that, you know, historically, on a long enough historical trajectory, obviously the parties have changed, you know, what they think multiple times. You know, if you go back 100 years, the Republican Party looks more like the Democratic Party looks more like the Republican Party. But the neoconservative hold over the Republican Party is not like a decades and decades and decades long thing. It's something that crept up on the party throughout the 80s and 90s, and then vis-a-vis the presidency of George W. Bush only after 9/11. George W. Bush did not run as a neoconservative. He, in some ways, sounded less neoconservative than Al Gore. Then 9/11 happened, and every instinct he had said that we shouldn't police the world and we should leave other countries alone went out the door. Or his staff overwhelmed or whatever happened. And then, yes, the neoconservative agenda ruled the day for the aughts. But historically, the Republican Party has had a lot of skepticism, in Treaty of Versailles skepticism, World War II skepticism, Vietnam, Korea. Those were all wars launched continued in some cases by Republicans, but in many cases escalated by Democrats and opposed by Republicans and leftists. And I'm saying the history of the Republican Party is if you go beyond just our lifetimes, is not been this. We should just be at war all the time. We support that kind of thing.
But why?
So how do we get back to that?
So I would argue that what we should be keeping our eyes on, and what's much more clarifying than how many conservatives are this way and how many Democrats are this way, is looking at some of the reasons why we might have taken a neocon turn. And I think your point about Bush is very instructive. Is it really a Bush changing his mind 9/11 question, or is it a Dick Cheney who's always been a neocon and has been a neocon since the Nixon years kind of a question? And what is the influence of defense contractor spending in Congress, in politics? How is that influence manifesting on the foreign policy front? During the Bush years, there was so much liberal criticism of the relationship between Dick Cheney and Halliburton in the self-serving, self-paying military-industrial complex that we were seeing very obviously, in an indiscreet way. And that has gone away, even as Joe Biden has continued to appoint former Raytheon executive as Secretary of Defense, et cetera. We saw in the middle of a kind of inflation crisis, Joe Biden taking time out of his schedule to go down to a military plant in, Alabama or Arkansas, somewhere in the Southeast, in a way that really seemed to reflect his priorities here. Now the cluster bomb conversation we're having is also a conversation about how we're not making enough weapons. If we're so desperate to send cluster bombs, it's because we're having deficits in our stockpiles, and we need to start making more weapons. And is all of this connected? And should we be looking more and holding our politicians more accountable to getting the influence of money out of politics more broadly, but specifically when it comes to the defense industry?
Yeah, it's if that industry is warping our priorities. I mean, we argue about how much it is due to that. I certainly think the influence of defense contractors makes a difference to individual members who those are factories in their districts, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And that there's also but I think there's also some kind of intellectual thing going on, or the deep state, the actual officials who comprise this national security apparatus exerting influence, not just to steer money to I think there's a lot of that, but I think it's also their ideology that this is the best thing to do.
I don't know. I tend to think that ideology has a basis. And it's not always rational. But people tend to have internal scripts for why they believe things. I think there was a time when people genuinely wanted to support the troops, that there was this idea that to be patriotic and to love your country, you had to support the troops, and that meant being pro-war. And over time, as veterans came back from these forever wars that were unpopular and losing, and they were saying, well, supporting us means getting us health care and housing when we come back and not forcing us to stay in Afghanistan doing God knows what for 20 years, then that started to change. And now we're in a world where I think that opened up a space for Donald Trump to say, you can be pro-American without being pro-war. And I think that's a powerful and really beneficial, constructive step in the right direction, but that can be so easily co-opted the same way that supporting our troops was co-opted as a kind of patriotism, ignoring the actual substantive interests of the actual service members. Yeah.
Again, it's interesting from the standpoint of who's going to be the next Republican standard bearer, because the foreign policy is not, I think, the most salient issue for a lot of just for our national conversation. I mean, we talk about it a lot because we think it's important. But I don't, it's not, you know what I mean? It's not the top of mind issue for a lot of people the way it was in the aughts. I don't think so.
I'm watching the excitement behind RFK Jr. among the left, among liberals, among independents, among a lot of people. And I am analyzing why there's something that feels like it's different happening there versus Marianne Williamson or even Cornel West, who has a very strong anti-war message, I would just say. But I think it has to do with being so openly adversarial on that particular issue, calling out Joe Biden on the cluster bomb issue, calling out Joe Biden on his handling of Ukraine. I don't know why. I can't entirely explain it. But it does seem to be. In fact, I just did an episode on my podcast today arguing with a prominent leftist debating a prominent leftist who founded Jacobin magazine about why it is that the left seems more invested in what a politician says about the war in Ukraine than Medicare for all, which was the entire animating principle of the Bernie movements for the last 6 or 7 years.
Well, that's what actually Tucker said that in that clip. You know, Trump is right about this, and all of Washington is wrong. That perception is not just foreign policy. A lot of people, the people I think who support RFK, feel that way. That Washington was wrong about foreign policy and COVID and spending priorities, domestic versus everywhere else, and a whole bunch of probably whether aliens are being hidden. A whole bunch of things. People are hungry for the truth. Yeah. They think they've been lied to because they have a lot of credible examples of the expert class getting it wrong, either because they were just sincerely wrong, oops, or because of pernicious manipulate society kind of designs, and the most successful people, to the extent RFK Jr. is so successful right now, he's calling out all of those things.
Yeah, sure.
That's part of his ideology, is that they all got so much wrong, and he thinks it like you because there's a lot of influencing going on, a lot of buying influence.
Yeah, corruption. Yeah, corruption is I think that's right. Yeah. And that manifests in different ways, but corruption is the animating force behind RFK Jr. I think it was also a galvanizing force behind Trump's first campaign, and it was a galvanizing focus issue for Bernie Sanders' first campaign as well. Maybe that's really what it is.
All right, more Rising right after this.